Hi there. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. This is where we dive deep into the trials and triumphs of conservation in Africa. And on this journey, we'll be dissecting Africa's conservation challenges and uncovering some really cool homegrown solutions. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Conservation Conversations. And in this podcast, we talk about all things conservation, everything from the challenges to the triumphs of protecting our planet, to the stories and strategies that are shaping the future of biodiversity in Africa. And of course, I'm your host, Elizabeth Gitaru, and I can't wait to have this conversation with you. So in the last episode, we had started our Invisible Fences series, and we started with part 1, the wild plains of Kenya. And in part 2, we are calling it the dangerous myth of the fortress park. And there is a popular myth in Kenyan conservation, and I dare say African conservation, the idea that wildlife lives in the national parks or by the wild. We imagine lions prowling within the Masai Mara, elephants grazing inside Amboseli, rhinos in Nairobi National Park, all respecting the invisible line of the gazetted boundary of the national park. We think of parks as the home of wildlife, self-contained and safe. But the data actually tells us differently. And those of you in conservation already know this, but this is to the guys who are not in conservation, by not in conservation, I mean not in the sector and practicing in the sector. 65% of Kenya's wildlife does not live in national parks. In fact, I think that number is higher. The majority of our biodiversity actually exists outside of these state fortresses. It lives on community land, it lives on private land, and it roams the group ranches of Laikipia, the conservancies of the Mara, the conservancies of southern Kenya, wandering through wheat farms in Narok, grazing next to cattle bombers in Amboseli, and the park is often just a dry season refuge. Think of it as a bedroom. The dispersal area, the land outside of the gates of the national park, the gates of the national reserve, is the dining room. That's where the animals go to feed. That's where they go to breed. That's where they go to survive in the wet season. This particular reality poses a very, very massive mismatch between the biology and the ecology and the law. Our strongest conservation tools, the statutes, the regulations, the protected area laws, are more often than not designed for the fortress that is national parks, sanctuaries, and conservation areas. They work best within a small fraction of land owned by the citizens of Kenya and managed by the state. The priority in national parks and national reserves is literally just protection of the wildlife animals and feeding of the wildlife animals. The story is different on community land and private land. The priority there is livelihood, production, and private use. Conservation becomes a secondary concern and almost always a burden to the landowner. When an elephant steps outside of Amboseli, it sort of leaves the full 100% protections that are afforded to it by the state through the national park and enters into the jurisdiction of private landowner and the community assembly under the Community Land Act. It moves from a zone of preservation and protection into quote-unquote a zone of production. And so suddenly, within that movement, the elephant stops becoming a national treasure. Think Craig, may he rest in peace, and starts becoming a problem animal, a pesky thing that is coming into complete and total collision with production, trampling wheat, trampling maize, destroying tomato crops, endangering livestock. So the corridors that we talked about in part 1 of the series that were invisible in law now become very, very visible in public and in practice when the human and the wildlife collide, bringing into fruition human-wildlife conflict. And so if we continue to think about protection and conservation law and focus majority of our national resources to these particular parks, we are literally just protecting a fraction of the ecosystem. It's like trying to secure a house, but you're closing the front door with like your security code, your fingerprint, your sensor, your alarm, and then all your windows are open, your back walls are missing. That is exactly what focusing on the national parks means, without focusing on protection for wildlife on public and private land. And so to conserve the 65% that is actually outside of state protection or state national parks, we must turn our attention to private land and community land law solutions. We need legal tools that actually work outside of the parks. Bearing in mind the conversation we had in part 1 around Article 40 and the right to property protection versus Article 69. So only by integrating private property law and community rights and ecological needs can we actually secure the survival of wildlife beyond the boundaries of the state. And so let's look at the constitutional conflict on fences, titles, and ecological integrity. To understand exactly why a simple wire fence in Kitengela or in Masai Mara or anywhere across the sweeping savannas of this beautiful country of ours is so incredibly difficult to remove, we must look beyond the immediate landscape. Let's travel back about 2,000 years. We leave the African plains for the marble forums of ancient Rome. The roots of the crisis facing Kenya's wildlife corridors today are not found in modern malice or, poaching, but would be calcified within Roman property law. And this is where we find the bundle of rights theory. And so this episode is going to be highly, highly focused around the legal tools and concepts that have led us into a state where we are in of an invisible fence in law that is very, very visible and highly destructive practically. Now, the concept of bundle of rights governs every title deed, literally in the world, let me not even say Kenya. And that trinity or that bundle of rights can be summarized as the right to use, the right to enjoy the fruits, and the rights to abuse your property. As long as you own property, these three sort of strata of rights accrue to you as a landowner. If you owned a title deed, say in Kiambu County, let's not even get into wildlife for now, you have the right to use that land however you want, obviously within the confines of the law, right? So you cannot say that you have the right to plant and then you plant marijuana. You will go to jail and then you'll start saying, oh, Elizabeth told me I can use my land however I want. No, please, within the confines of the law. You have the right to enjoy the fruits of the land, meaning the economic engine of the property. And then you have the right to abuse, which doesn't literally, mean maliciously destroying your land, but the ultimate power of transformation, the right to alienate the land, to sell it, to subdivide it, that sort of thing, to exclude others from it. So you're able to say you cannot enter or trespassers will be shot, like, our friends in Texas, so on and so forth. The fence is not merely like a collection of cedar points and chain link wire. It's the physical representation of the right to abuse or the concrete manifestation of your constitutional right to say no. This legal reality creates a very profound conflict when placed in the backdrop of the Kenyan Constitution. On one side, like we said in part 1, you have Article 40, which in legal circles is known as the capitalist clause, which enshrines the right to private property, the protection and the sanctity of the title deed, offering the landowner certainty, security, and the power of exclusion. On the other side, the ecological reality of the wildlife corridor. Unlike the rigid and straight lines of a deed plan, the corridor is fluid. It shifts with the rains, it bends with the topography, it exists only in the collective memory of the herd, right, as opposed to on a piece of paper. So when those two words collide in a court of law, almost always certainty will triumph over fluidity because the law prefers the fixed coordinates of a title deed over the shifting, ephemeral path of an elephant. 20 years ago, it used to use this corridor. Now, because of climate change, this is the new corridor, so on and so forth. Consequently, Article 40 now becomes the invisible fence, the shield that makes the physical barriers actually virtually invisible, to traditional conservation efforts. The tragedy of this hierarchy is actually the destruction of Kenya's ecosystems. This destruction of Kenya's ecosystem is not actually being driven by crime, by malice, it's actually driven by lawful compliance of the law. We often imagine that the end of great migrations will come at the hands of poachers or illegal encroachers, but the truth is actually a little bit sadly bureaucratic. The corridors are dying a slow death by 1,000 fences. A farmer fences 5 acres to protect a crop, very legally, by the way, because of Article 40. A developer in Nairobi buys 10 acres for a holiday home. He puts up a wall to protect it. A farmer subdivides his group ranch parcel of 50 acres amongst his 10 sons. Each son gets 5 acres. They also then subdivide amongst their heirs. They should actually subdivide amongst their, children as opposed to sons, but we'll get there in another episode around the patriarchy of conservation. Well, we'll get it. When you take these tiny sections individually, they're quite innocent exercises, and every person can cite Article 40 and the Land Act and the Land Registration Act to protect their constitutional rights. But when you bring them together, the Swahili say haba na haba hujaza kibaba, they become actually catastrophic. They literally slice open the ecosystem into a checkerboard of dead ends, literally legislating migration into extinction. And so the challenge of conservation law, of modern conservation law, is not really enforcement, but innovation. We cannot simply ban fences because that would strip citizens of their constitutional rights. We can't demand that landowners forego their livelihoods for the sake of wildlife. that they do not have a direct right of enjoyment directly to them, So the solution actually lies in recognizing that if we want landowners to surrender their right to exclude, we must be willing to treat that right as a tradable commodity. We must trade it in the marketplace. We must place an economic value to that particular right. And I know I'm going to step on quite a number of toes here when we start talking about looking at the economic viability of wildlife conservation, because there's a certain section of conservationists who say that wildlife and natural resources should be conserved for their own utility, and that there should be no burden or expectation or obligation for natural resources to proffer an economic benefit. But that's actually not true, and that's living in a utopian sort of world. Because this same person that you're telling they need to give up their land for conservation and allow wildlife to migrate through their land does not have a plan B. And you might find that the person who often argues such things is someone with a salary, with a house in Nairobi or any other urban center. They have not had to deal with the actual consequences and impacts of planting maize so that they can grow, you take them to market and pay school fees for your children, or take your children to school, or take your mother to hospital, and then elephants coming and tramping all of that down. It's very, very difficult to ask that person or that landowner to engage in conservation as a demonstration of his altruism, as opposed to that he needs to proffer an economic benefit from that. 26th and 27th of February 2026.
From 9 a.m. to 4 p.m.
at Dusit Hotel, Westlands.
45,000 per person.
For all managers, owners, directors, overseers, controllers of any public benefit organization and any social enterprise.
And we'll be discussing all matters tax. We'll give you practical steps. We'll tell you what KRA is looking for, and we'll help you save money, because that's what we do best.
And we'll also help you with governance. How do you structure? What are your internal policies? What are you going to do when your donor asks for audited accounts?
See you there.
See you there. Moving from a model of conflict to a model of transaction is actually a promise that's embedded in the Wildlife Act of 2013. For the very first time, the law provided tools to bridge the gap between private rights and public ecology. We can now sit down with a landowner and offer a contract through conservation easements and environmental leases. We offer the landowner the right to retain their title deed as owner, the right to continue living on and using their land as a landowner, and they may even graze on their land and graze their livestock on the land in exchange for guaranteed income, where they agree only to suspend their right to fence. So instead of coming in with a stick, using the law as a stick and saying, we have burnt all fences, which will be very contradictory and contravening to Article 40, we use a carrot and actually offer monetary value for them foregoing their right to fence. And so by monetizing the corridor, the Wildlife Act then allows us to turn wildlife from a nuisance into a tenant. It turns the right to exclude into a right to conserve, where we now prove that the only way to dismantle the invisible fence that we're talking about is not to cut the wire, but to actually pay for the right to never string up the wire in the first place. And so what's the magic of buying the right to never build a fence? If we start from the premise that we cannot simply strip a landowner of their constitutional right to fence their land, that the right of abuses is untouchable, then we are left with a seemingly impossible deadlock. The law protects the fence, and nature requires the open plain or the open plains. But the Wildlife Act actually introduces a solution that does not rely on coercion, but choice, found under Section 65, a provision that contains perhaps the most elegant legal innovation in Kenyan conservation history, the wildlife conservation easement. To the average lawyer, the word easement is uninspiring. It's dry, dusty, it's used and reserved for mundane utility disputes, allowing KPLC to use a power cable over a roof, or the right of a neighbor to drive across your driveway to get to their land. In traditional property law, it's actually a burden placed on land for a specific, very often very trivial purpose. But Section 65 actually turned this mundane legal tool into a weapon for nature. Under this section, a wildlife conservation easement actually allows a landowner to voluntarily place a restriction on their own title deed. It functions as a negative covenant. Instead of agreeing to do something, the landowner is agreeing not to do something. So the landowner signs the binding legal agreement and says, I will still own this land. It's still mine. I can still pass it on to my heirs. I can still sell it or lease it. But I voluntarily surrender my right to build a fence. I voluntarily surrender my right to plant maize. Through this specific migratory path. I voluntarily surrender my right to build a skyscraper. I surrender my right to block the movement of wildlife in exchange for X and X amount of money. So you've actually placed a monetary value to those specific rights. It's no longer elephants are majestic, the lion is the king of the jungle, they're so beautiful to look at, let our tourists come and take pictures. No, it is a handshake between friends. But the most crucial aspect of this conservation easement is that it is a registered legal instrument that attaches itself to the land and to the title deed and not to the owner. So that it does not matter who owns the land into the future. As long as the as long as the conservation easement still runs, title deed can be transferred to a new owner and the conservation easement will still remain. If the current owner sells the land tomorrow, the new buyer acquires the property, but they also acquire the restrictions with the environmental easement or the conservation easement. What this means is that the obligation to keep the fences down runs with the title, ensuring that the conservation status of the corridor is not just, subject to the whims of the market and the changing of hands. The easement runs with the title deed, ensuring that the conservation status of the corridor is actually not subject to the changing of hands. It etches the migratory route into the DNA of the title deed, creating a permanence that, a simple agreement could actually never achieve, and ascribing an economic value to the rights of the landowner. So the question, I guess, that comes to mind is why would a landowner agree to such an agreement? Why would a rancher in a rock voluntarily reduce the functional value of their property, voluntarily say, I'm not going to plant wheat, and yet, wheat farming leasing is actually a really good source of livelihood? The answer lies in Section 70 of the Act, Incentives and Benefit Sharing. This section acknowledges a fundamental truth that conservationists have actually ignored for decades. Conservation is a form of land use, like any other land use, whether it's commercial, industrial, agricultural. Conservation is a form of land use, and it must pay at market rates. In exchange for the easement, the landowner receives the tangible benefit that is money. So for a century, we have treated the protection of wildlife as a charitable endeavor. NGOs have literally, the sector has been subsidized by conservation NGOs for the longest time. We have asked rural communities, indigenous communities, to love nature, to save the elephants, to support the rhino out of moral obligation, out of altruism, even as their crops are being trampled and their livestock is being killed. We have expected them to bear the cost of the conservation, while the entire world has reaped the aesthetic value of wildlife. Because remember what we said by starting the episode, 65% of wild animals are not in national parks. So Section 65 and Section 70 actually dismantle this model of charity and replace it with a model of socioeconomic and socio-legal agreements and contracts. It's no longer, we are asking you for a favor, we are beseeching you to conserve wildlife. No, we are monetizing the right to dispose of the property and monetizing the right to erect the fence, therefore ensuring that the law then transforms the wildlife corridor from a burden into an asset for the community owner, or for the private landowner. So that then we now save the ecosystem whilst making it more profitable for the landowner and ultimately for the wildlife as well. Thank you very much for staying until the end of this episode. And I hope that has clarified the actual legal angle and one of the key solutions to the invisible fence. I look forward to having the next conversation with you. And in part 3, we are going to look at the private contracts that actually rescued the Masai Mara and other ecosystems in the world. In Kenya. And until the next time, I'm your host, Elizabeth Gitari Mitaro. And remember, there's no action that's too small for you to save the world. Bye.